Family is a gift from God, a place where love takes root and faith grows stronger each day. It is within the family that we find comfort, support, and the deep connections that shape who we are. Through every joy and every challenge, we lean on one another, held together by love, grace, and shared faith. In moments of prayer, laughter, and even struggle, our hearts are reminded that God's presence lives within our homes and within each relationship we cherish. Family is more than blood. It is a bond of love, trust, and unwavering support. With faith at the center, these connections become our strength, our hope, and our lasting peace.
Last Sunday we talked about the very first home, and today we're talking about husbands, that one of two persons that play a key role in each home. But as we come into our passage today, I want us to remember something about the way of Jesus, the message of Jesus. The message of Jesus is always countercultural. I want us to hear that. The message of Jesus is always countercultural. Always. Whenever the message of Jesus or Christianity goes mainstream, it ceases to be Christianity. It always calls us to more, to something higher, to something better, and it is always countercultural in all its aspects. And what was true in Jesus' day is true for us today. And in our passage this morning, we're going to find Paul, one of Jesus' disciples, writing some very countercultural things, truths about the home, and most specifically about husbands and wives. The year's around 60 A.D., and at the time, the home, marriage, was in danger of extinction for a number of reasons. One being that the Jews, as a people, had a very low opinion of women. As far as the Jews were concerned, the men, women were nothing but property to be owned. And women had no rights at all. So therefore, a woman could not divorce her husband for any reason, but a Jewish man could divorce his wife for every reason. And they did. Well, the Greeks were even worse than that. You look at the Greek civilization, and prostitution was a reality of everyday Greek life. A respectable Greek woman stayed at home and cared for the home in seclusion. She ran the home while her husband ran around. Always. And what made matters worse, that there was no real law in place about how the divorces should be conducted, so one simple word could end a marriage, and it often did. The Jews, the Greeks, but worse of all were the Romans at that time. Because in the Roman culture, men and women divorced and remarried and divorced and remarried and divorced and remarried over and over and over again. History tells of one woman who had been through 10 husbands. Another woman who had married 8 husbands, 8 different men in 5 years. But then there was one, I think, that takes the cake of all how bad it really was a woman who was married to her 23rd husband. Now hear that. 23rd husband, and she herself was his 21st wife. And into that kind of broken world, into our world, Paul writes a countercultural message where he calls men and women to a new kind of home, to a new kind of a relationship together, to a new kind of reality whereby they come together under the auspices and the love and the care of Jesus. And Paul says, to have this radically new kind of home, husbands are to love their wives sacrificially. He puts it on the husbands first. They are to love their wives sacrificially. And he writes these words out of the book of Ephesians. He starts off, husbands, love your wives. Not husbands, it would be nice if you thought about loving your wives. Not husbands, it would probably be best for you if you love your wives. Not husbands, try to love your wives. He simply says, straightforward and emphatically, husbands, love your wives. I want to say that. Say that with me. Husbands, love your wives. Hear that. And the word he uses here for love is the word agapao. And it's a very powerful Greek word for love. It's the most deepest, self-giving, sacrificial, volitional kind of love a person can give to another individual. It is not based upon emotion, but is based upon the will. It is the highest good we wish for another human being. Over years of counseling, both in the military and in the ministry, I've had different husband couples come to me for counseling at times. And sometimes the husbands would come and say to me, I don't love my wife anymore. I tell them, love your wife. Or I've had more come to me, well, I'm not happy anymore. My wife does not make me happy anymore. I tell them, love your wife. Or others that come say, I don't think my wife loves me anymore. And I say to him, love your wife. You see, agapao love is a mental choice. It is unconditional. It chooses to love another person no matter what. And this almost is hard for us to wrap our minds around. How's that even possible? Then Paul gives us the ultimate example of agapao love, and he says, husbands, love your wives just exactly as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Husbands, that's what agapao love is and looks like. It is Jesus loving us, the church, so unconditionally, so completely, irregardless of what we do or won't do with Jesus. He loves us to that point that for every individual, for the church, for all humanity, he gave up his life on the cross for us. And that, my friends, is agapao love. The greatest example humanity has ever seen. And we are to love our wives to exactly to that same extent. But this marital agapao love has a purpose. You see, there's a reason that Jesus gave his life for us, died for us, took the nails for us, took the beatings for us, had this thorn stuck in his head for us. There is a purpose for, oh yes, he loved us, but there was more than that love. He had a purpose. And there's something that he wanted to do in us and to accomplish in us. And as husbands, as we follow Jesus' perfect example of love, what is it that we want to do to? What is it that Jesus wants us to accomplish in the hearts of our wives? And Paul tells us that part of this agapao love, that as just as he loved the church and gave himself up for it, husbands are to love their wives to make them holy. For see what this says. Jesus gave up his life for the church, for the community of faith, the believers, to make her holy. Hagiadzo. It is to purify, to free from sin, to make right internally by the renewing of the soul, to dedicate one's life to God. So Jesus gave up his life on the cross, died for us, to bring us into a right relationship with God, to make us holy, to cleanse us from our sins, to purify our souls by the renewing of our souls, and to dedicate our lives to God. And this is nothing other than spiritual formation. You know, we've talked a lot about that, and you remember the example of the cup and the water being poured, the dirty water flowing out, and the clean water of Jesus pouring in. This is the process of spiritual formation that Paul is writing about, to make her holy. You see, out of a husband's sacrificial love, and as he grows closer to Jesus and he is spiritually formed, he comes to realize that his greatest responsibility, one of his greatest responsibilities in life, is to help in the spiritual formation of his wife. For he says, he writes, cleansing her by the washing with the water through the Word, by reading the Bible with her, by being still with her, by worshiping with her, by loving her, by doing everything to form her and to make her holy and purify her, and also by praying with her. And I think especially to help make her holy, cleanse her by praying for her. I remember back when I was in Prospect, Kentucky, years ago. We had a deacon sort of mini retreat, spiritual weekend. We're all gathered around together, talking about being vulnerable and transparent. All these guys were married, and they had wives, some of them older, some of them younger. And just getting a sense of where they were at spiritually. And I asked, all right, guys, how many of you all pray for your wives? Pray with your wives. I mean, really pray with your wives. I'm not talking about before dinner prayer, God bless his food. I'm talking about how many of you really pray with your wives? Silence. All no eye contact. Everybody looked away or looked down. I got nothing in that. Man, just a silence. And one of my deacons, so I said, what's wrong? You guys don't pray with your wives? Are you telling me that none of you pray with your wives? And one of the deacons had the audacity to tell me, but Scott, it's awkward. I said, awkward? What? You guys live with your wives? You go to bed with your wives? You have baby with your wives? You live with your wives, and you're telling me that it's awkward for you to pray with your wives? I said, hey, we've got to talk about this. And talk about this we did. And just as Jesus loved the church and gave himself up for her, all that he had, his life, to make her holy, husbands are to spiritually form their wives, to make them holy, so that one day they can present her to Jesus as a radiant person, as a radiant wife, a church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless before God. We are to love our wives sacrificially. We are to love our wives in the hope and the process of making them holy. And husbands are to love their wives by caring for them. And Paul moves forward with this. He says, in this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. See, in the same way of loving our wives sacrificially, in the same way of loving our wives in order to make them holy, we ought to love our wives as their own bodies, as ourselves, because he who loves his wife loves himself. See, unlike the Jewish mind who saw a woman as a piece of property, unlike the Greek mind who saw wives that just stayed home and ran the house while the husbands ran around, unlike the Roman mind which said, hey, marry and remarry and marry again, Paul says that the mind of Jesus, the person who is following Jesus, the husband is following Jesus, is seeking to have a new radical kind of home, formed by sacrificial love of Jesus. purpose to make the home holy before Jesus. And they're far more than just two people living together and coexisting. Man, this is where they're so intertwined. When one of them hurts, the other hurts. And the husband and the wife are so close together that when the wife is grieving, the husband inside is moved with pain. And when the wife is experiencing joy, the husband laughs out loud with her. And why wouldn't the husband want to love his wife as himself? I don't know about you, but I prefer joy over pain. And if loving my wife brings me joy and she feels joy, then why not? He says that he feeds at their own bodies. He says, after all, no one hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it just as Christ does the church, for we are all members of his body. So husbands, give yourself up and sacrificially love your wife. Husbands, give yourself up and spiritually form your wife. Husbands, give yourself up and care for your wife. Just give yourself up. Give of yourself so that you can know the marriage and the life that Jesus has created you and your wife to live. And he finishes up and says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Man, there's nothing better than a home, a husband who understands what it is to love his wife as Jesus wants him to love his wife. I heard a story about a truck driver. His wife was filling out a form for a job. And she stayed at home, and when we got to the point, what is your present occupation? And she said, housewife. And the husband interrupted and said, no, you're not a housewife. You are my wife. And husbands, she is your wife. And last week I challenged husbands and you all to each day tell your wife that you loved her, that you appreciate her through text, through flowers, however that was, whatever that looked like. Every day to tell her some way, shape, or form you love her. And there's a different challenge this week. This is a little bit harder. I want to challenge you this week as part of your spiritual formation in her to pray with her every day. This is not God bless us food at dinner time. This is, I want you to pray with her. And it doesn't have to be a 20-minute prayer. It doesn't have to be long. But something where you set aside a few moments of time in the day. And you turn your cell phone off. And you disengage from all the distractions of the world. And you and her are just there together in that moment. And you take her hand. And then you say to her, let's pray. And begin. If you can't do 7 days, 6, 2, 1, whatever you can do to do something this week to pray with your wife.